ancestor. Ashe. James Farmer, the founder of the Congress of Racial Equality. Our dear brother and instigator, John Lewis. Frederick Douglass. Martin Luther King Jr. El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. C.T. Vivian. Pauli Murray. Howard Thurman. A. Philip Randolph. Mary McLeod Bethune. Harriet Tubman. Jarena Lee. Sojourner Truth. Nat Turner. Huey P. Newton. Bobby Seale. Bobby Hutton. Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. We also want to call on some of the names of the Africans on the continent and around the world who worked in conjunction with the Black church and collaborated with us, our freedom fighters here in America. Dutty Boukman of Haiti. Toussaint Louverture of Haiti. Nani of the Maroons. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. Ya Asantwa of Ghana. Desmond Tutu. Nelson Mandela. Stephen Bantu Biko. Julius Nyerere. Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. We can stand here all day and call names, and we would never call all the names of those who contributed to the greatness of this country and this world. The Bible talks about the cloud of witnesses. These are our ancestors. And when you call on one, you call on all of them. So don't take this ritual lightly. I would like to close this libation with lyrics from a song by Breaths, a song called Breaths. Those who have died have never, never left. The dead have a pact with the living. They're in the woman's breast. They're in the wailing child. They're with us in our homes. They're with us in the crowd. The dead have a pact with the living. Listen more often to things than to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath. When the fire's voice is heard, 'tis the ancestors' breath. It's the voice of the waters. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo.
Sawubona. Your response, yay, Sawubona. Sawubona. It is good to see you, brothers and sisters. We thank you so much for joining us for this sacred conversation. We have invited into the room our ancestors. They are now among us. They are always with us, dwelling with us. They are excited about this moment. Ashe? This, I believe, is a part of their dream that we would come together and have such powerful and sacred conversation. I am Pastor Hodari Williams, the pastor here at New Life, and on behalf of the New Life session and Pastor Dr. Mark Lomax and the First African session, we would like to invite you to this joint gathering where we are going to engage in some powerful dialogue, and it will be a dialogue. Those of you who entered into the sanctuary should have received a pen and a pad. We want you to take notes. We want you to write down questions. We want you to engage in this moment. I won't prolong it any longer. I want to bring to the stage my dear friend, a brilliant mind among us, He is doing powerful work across this country with churches. He is the former president of the Interdenominational Theological Center, where he moved that institution forward greatly. I am so proud of this brother. We went to seminary together. I have watched him over the years just transform into this amazing individual who has touched the lives of so many. Would you all please welcome to this stage the Matthew Wesley Williams, who will lead us today and facilitate us in this conversation.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. A good afternoon indeed it is. How good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters and siblings all to gather together in unity. It is good to be here and good to see you. To Pastor Williams, to Pastor Lomax, to this New Life family for your co-hosting, we thank you. First African, we thank you for your co-hosting of this sacred conversation. And to this conversation, we say welcome. Welcome to this sacred conversation. I'm pleased and privileged to be your moderator and facilitator for our time together this afternoon, where we gather under this timely theme, a sacred conversation, black faith in a culture of chaos. Black faith in a culture of chaos. So allow me to say a word about this conversation, which I will after we introduce our speakers. But first, I want to say a word about the nature of this conversation, right? That this will not be another sage on stage only moment. But this is a community conversation. So when I say welcome, I mean a big welcome, right? And what do I mean by a big welcome? That means welcome with all that you bring, with all that you are, your ancestry and your progeny, your anxieties and your aspirations, your fears, your frustrations, your dreams, your hopes, even hopes unborn that have died. Welcome with all that you bring and all that you are, because this conversation could only be what it is, both online and in person, with your presence. It's easy to be in a room and not yet be in the room. But this conversation calls for your full presence. Why? Because, as Howard Thurman said when he wrote to Mordecai Johnson, our people need us.
Yes, yes.
Our people need you. Yes, sir, Dr. West. And so we're called here not just to have a perfunctory conversation, but the times are urgent. And we will be called out of this place to action, rooted in who we are and whose we are. So I won't delay, I won't belabor. On that note, I want to move directly into the meat of our time together and introduce our featured guests and our dialogue partners. And after I introduce them, I want to frame this conversation in light of our theme, say a little bit about our process, how this is going to be a community conversation, and then we'll jump right in. First, let me take delight in introducing my dear sister, my friend, my comrade, Rahel Tesfamariam. Rahel is the author of the newly released book that you'll have an opportunity to purchase and sign and get signed after our time together. Imagine Freedom. Imagine Freedom, transforming pain into political and spiritual power. Rahel is an award-winning activist, journalist, theologian, and speaker. She is a former Washington Post columnist and the founder of The Urban Cusp, a cutting-edge online community that highlighted faith and highlights faith, social change, culture, and global awareness. She is a diasporic activist and intellectual. From Ferguson to Palestine to South Africa and beyond, Rahel has been a freedom fighter, theologian, and organizer par excellence. So please, stage, my dear sister, Rahel Tesfamariam. course, I'm also delighted to welcome a long-distance runner in the fight for freedom and justice, one who really doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce you anyway. Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West. Dr. West is easily the most recognized and iconic public intellectual of our time. And he now is a candidate in the 2024 campaign for President of the United States of America. Dr. West is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary, Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, and former university professor at Harvard University. Author of 20 books, including the one that introduced me to him and his work, Race Matters. His memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. And this event is the last stop to his visit in this city here in the state of Georgia, just ahead of the primaries coming up this Tuesday. He'll say, I'm sure, a little more about the tour that he's taken of what has become the epicenter of national politics here in the state of Georgia. But now we are so grateful that Dr. West now joins us for this sacred conversation. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. To moment. We'll roll with it. So allow me to frame our conversation for a moment, then I'm going to take a seat and we're going to begin our dialogue. We do live in a culture of chaos. And I would say in a time of apocalypse. We know that the last book of the Bible, Revelation, is actually the apocalypse of John. The revelation is the apocalypse, which means not like the Walking Dead, the end of the world. It's actually the uncovering, the unveiling, the revelation of the world as it is. And this conversation is an opportunity for us to respond to the question, what time is it? To locate ourselves in time and history and to refuse to turn away from the exceedingly high stakes of the moment in which we live. We are in a culture and an age of chaos where the resurgence of the children of the Confederacy are now led by a would-be dictator who has declared his intent to dismantle any semblance of democracy. We are witnessing genocides in Palestine and the Congo funded by American tax dollars, armed by the U.S. government, and spurred by not just U.S. corporations, but our own technological addictions. We are in a moment that was in many ways unleashed by the pandemic, in which there now is a general sense that the systems we inherited and the structures we inhabit are crumbling before our eyes. Meanwhile, Mama Earth is saying, I will make myself uninhabitable if you don't change your ways and stop exploiting and extracting from me. So here we have climate crisis that threatens our very existence on the planet. And this morning, Sunday morning, if you were to listen to far too many houses of worship, we are going on with business as usual. Having internalized an otherworldly evangelicalism that worships a capitalistic Christ, but refuses to consider what it means to actually follow in the way of that Palestinian Jew called Jesus. But that culture of crisis, now we placed in conversation with black faith. With black faith. You know, in the first creation story in the Hebrew Bible, we're reminded that chaos is a precondition for creation. In the beginning, out of a formless void, the Creator said, let there be, and let us make, and there was. And we who are made in the Creator's image and likeness now have the capacity to create out of chaos a new order. This is the best of black faith. And so it's time for us to Sankofa, to go back and fetch the best of our ancestral heritage, to now co-create out of the bowels of chaos the conditions for future generations and the earth to flourish. Cole Arthur Riley, in her book Black Liturgy, says, in a country that is so staunchly delusional about its own history, so committed to a collective amnesia, it is a feat to remember rightly. We are here to remember rightly. So let us dig into the best of our heritage, to remember the best of who we are, and imagine freedom in the midst of this culture of chaos. This sets the context for our sacred conversation. And again, this is a conversation. So you have paper, you have pens, and it's not just to take notes, but it's also to pay attention to what's coming up in you, right? Again, this won't merely be a Sage on Stage event, but in a community conversation, we're going to take a little time between pronouncements to punctuate those pronouncements with our own conversations. You're going to turn right and left. How many times have we been in public conversations where we missed the genius sitting right next to us? So we're going to practice a little democracy here, right? And be in dialogue, not just with those who are on this stage, but in dialogue with ourselves and with one another. So our format is going to begin with our guests modeling the art of democratic dialogue with one another. And at some point, they're going to pose a question to you who are in person here and who are online. And we're going to take a little time for you to have some opportunities to talk with one another. And then our final segment will be kind of an open forum. And we'll guide our way through that. And we'll finally be closed out with a charge from one of our co-hosting pastors, Dr. Mark Lomax. And so I'm going to take my seat, and we're going to begin this dialogue. And I want to invite Dr. West to open us up, to tell us what time it is. What are the stakes in this conversation? Why you've chosen to run for this office now, and what does black faith have to do with it?
Let's give it up for our dear brother, President Matthew Wesley. I want to begin by acknowledging where we are. This is consecrated by those since 1998, united out of great courage. Brother says, what time it is? Time to fight. Time to tell the truth. Condition of truth. Allow suffering to cease. Time to recognize the emerging out of years where it looked as if we had some great breakthrough, and we did. We broke the back, vicious and apartheid. That is a major achievement. 50 years later, what do we see? Still see organized greed, hatred running amok, and much conformity, complacency, even cowardliness for a black leader, black spokesperson. We were predicating our movement on that would highlight the least of these. But I've been blessed. Not 70 years since I've been always ready. And they gave me a sense of what moral and spiritual greatness was, not just worldly. I have a biblical thing is called not great. Oh, my definition. Here she is among you. Trying to get all the kenosis that giving of yourself to others in such a way. Hello, Baptist Church. I am an extension of the black church tradition, but of the prophetic wing. We had pastors. We didn't have CEOs. We had thick blood at the cross. We didn't have Kool-Aid, that thin stuff. We had deacons and deaconess who cared for us. Didn't have kids themselves, but embraced the children because they were on a love train and they were passing on love from one generation to the next. And I'm talking about the best, not the worst. I'm talking about the best of the church. I was blessed to be shaped by that love. I'll never forget it, and I will be faithful. Because when I was baptized 62 years ago, it wasn't just an ordinary dunk in the water. I came out of being on fire for truth and justice, and we had so many folk to look to. We had Martin, we had Malcolm, we had Fannie Lou, we had Ella Baker. It was so many. We had Hugh, we had Bobby, we had Fred Hampton. It was so many. They became examples of what it meant to serve. The Black Panther Party was right next to my church. So when I went to school, the first thing I did was join the prison teaching program. The first thing I did was join the breakfast program. Didn't join the party because they were pretty secular and atheistic, and they were hard on the church, and there was enough church folk out there to justify the criticism in part. But I told them I'm a Jesus-loving, free black man. So I'll work with you till day up and day down. But I'm not giving up on Jesus. They embraced me. And of course, they were listening to Aretha during the day, so they know Aretha come out of the same church tradition that I do. Inseparable. But I embrace my Muslim brothers and sisters. I don't exist without Malcolm X. I don't exist without Muhammad Ali. I don't exist without Naima Coltrane. I embrace my Buddhists like bell hooks. And I certainly embrace my secular brothers and sisters, the Paul Baldwin, Angela Davis. Out of love and integrity, I go by means of the blood at the cross. They go in the secular way. I still think I got something they got, but that ain't the point right now. That's not the point. We were in it together. And this candidate ain't nothing but a moment in a movement. It's a small wave in an ocean of a great people. And black people at our best are a great people because in the face of 400 years of chronic hatred, we dish out love warriors every generation. We've taught the world so much about what love is and how to love concretely. And you begin it by loving yourself. Being hated for so long, the self-hatred inside of oneself is so deep that when you love yourself, you become, lo and behold, a revolutionary agent. But to put it another way, when you're niggerized and you're washed by the blood at the cross, Jesus will de-niggerize you and take the fear out of you, take the self-doubt out of you, and take the self-violation out of you and make you a new person willing to tell the truth, willing to fight for freedom, willing to pursue justice. Why? Because you know folk are worthy of being loved. Don't love black people in order for black people to love you back. Love black people because they're worthy of being loved. Yeah. That's true for anybody, but I begin on the chocolate side of town. Get it right with the chocolate folk, then you know with the vanilla brothers and sisters, you can get it right with them. You begin with the vanilla folk and you chocolate. You already got things twisted. We've had leaders that love everybody but black people. That's part of the crisis, part of the chaos, as it were. I don't want to go on too long, though, brother. I want to give as much time to my dear sister Rahel as I can. Very much so. Was that enough? I should have gone on. you let me know now.
That's enough.
You
There'll be
let me
more.
go.
There'll be more.
Because we Baptists get in Presbyterian church, but whoa, this sermon I heard this morning sounded like a Baptist and a Pentecost. I said, oh, this is a Presbyterian church, but it has been rich.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Strong legacy, Doc. Strong legacy. Thank you, Dr. West. So, Rahel, I'll pose the same question, and I'll ask you to respond in the context of what imagining freedom, particularly in a moment of chaos like this, and a culture of chaos looks like. What's at stake in this moment for you and for us? And what does black faith have to do with it?
I come from a tradition that says not lean on your own. So I lean not on my own understanding. But I ask the question, what time has it always been? Because there's a way in which all these things are, we watch a genocide unfold and think that what we're watching is new. That settler colonialism, apartheid regimes are new. Genocide is new. But where did we learn the ways of apartheid from? Where did we learn the ways of settler colonialism from? Where did we learn the annihilation of indigenous people from? Where did we learn how people can be wiped off of their own land and set off to the side on reservations? Wiped out, remnants only left. For centuries, told this land is not your land. And so now we're watching this unfold and acting as if Stein is new, Congo is new, Tigray is new, as if empire is new. And so I get angry with our folks because I think in some ways we have had to forget what America has done to live within America. How are you violated? How are you traumatized and live under that trauma and live under that violation unless you excuse the one who did it to you? You have to forget. Because if you remember daily, how are you American? We have had to forget what this country did to them and to us. Because that's the only way we can survive this land. There's a certain psychosis that's required to be American. Because you literally live amongst your violator. Right? And the only way to survive that is to forget what they've done to you. And so our forgetfulness has been an act of survival. So I forgive us because we needed to do it to survive. We needed to do it to survive. But at some point, we're called to task and say, if we don't remember, if we don't acknowledge, if we don't recognize, what story will we tell our children? What story will we tell future generations? That we were a witness to this? We were a conspirer. We literally allowed it, watched it. Well, let me take you to the only book that I think really matters in this moment. A story of people subjugated for 400 years under Egypt, a land of trauma, living under Pharaoh, stripped, deculturalization, stripped of language, heritage, everything you could ever imagine, identity stolen from them, used as labor for production. And when they were brought into the wilderness, they longed for. What did they crave? Did they really appreciate manna from the heavens? Did they really appreciate what God gave them from the heavens? No, they longed for Pharaoh. They missed Egypt. They had developed this intimacy with Pharaoh. Intimacy with Pharaoh. So much so that Pharaoh was long gone. But Pharaoh had shaped their minds, shaped their habits, shaped their worldview, where Pharaoh ain't even have to be in the room no more. Pharaoh didn't have to be in the church no more. Pharaoh didn't have to be on a pulpit no more, because Pharaoh had taken over their mind. Carter G. Woodson said it. If you control a man or a woman's mind, you don't have to tell them to go through the back door. They'll do it out of habit. And we've learned the ways of empire. We've learned the ways of capitalism, so much so that we move like our oppressor. We talk like our oppressor. We do the work of our oppressor. Pharaoh's no longer needed. Who needs Pharaoh when we do the work of Pharaoh? Right? So the chaos is within our own bodies. The chaos is within our own minds. It's how we relate to this country. It's how we relate to money. It's how we relate to power. It's how we relate to luxury. We are the chaos. Right? So if we talk about healing our community, if we talk about restoring our communities, first heal and free ourselves from our seduction, from our idol worship. No, you don't even need false prophets anymore. Not necessary. But what I would say is, I was in Yale Divinity School. My mentor said my job to find him. So if I would leave you with anything about how to undo this chaos, you must acknowledge that they took you from you, and it is your job to find him. Because the Jesus I worship, the Jesus that I, as a nationalist, revolutionary, liberation theologian, Pan-Africanist, the Jesus that I can hold my head up and worship and call Lord and Savior, right, died on a raggedy cross. Naked he came, naked he left, bruised, wounded. Everybody abandoned him. State killed him, political prisoner, stripped of everything. Literally the divine, and they saw him as trash, treated him as trash. He embodied resurrection. Embodied resurrection. So reclaim your Jesus from empire. Reclaim your Jesus from capitalism. Reclaim, and I have to say this, in the year of politics, where our brother has the audacity to run for president, the audacity to imagine a new way, the audacity to think beyond a two-party system, the audacity to say, I don't need you and what you represent, and I will do it for the sake of my people, and for such a time as this, speak up for Palestine, right? Vote or no vote, there's always been a prophet from the wilderness. Always been a prophet from the wilderness. Last question for me is, when we speak of the audacity of hope, whose hope are we talking about? Audacity of hope. Hope are we talking about?
Powerful. Amen. Amen. Nashe. Let's give them both a round of applause.
Oh, thank you. My dear sister.
And I want to thank you both for calling us into a process of sacred memory, of remembering, and in so doing, avoiding nostalgia. Because in a moment like this, in order for us to see clearly, we recognize that incomplete stories generate insufficient strategies. Right? So, what would you, this is going to be the prompt that I'm going to ask you to give to the community, both who are with us online and are with us in person, that will prompt a brief conversation among us. What must we remember in this moment? What must we go back and fetch? Like the Sankofa bird with the egg in its mouth moving forward, the best of our legacy to forge a future for future generations. What must we remember?
Yes. Ooh, God bless you. I think of the greatest literary artist by her conception of like Catholic, traces African religion. Her notion of re-memory and rememory is first you have to keep track of how things got dismembered, dispersed, shattered, spread out, which means you have to have a set of lens that help you understand what went into the dismembering. That's where the greed and the hatred, the three hounds of hell that the great Howard Thurman talks about in 1949, Jesus and the disinherited, the text that Martin Luther King Jr. walked around with. And then you have to talk about what brings people together. The title of her novel is what? Beloved. Juxtapose that with John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. Stevie Wonder's Love in Need of Love. What really brings people together, given the processes of predatory capitalism, greed, white supremacy, male supremacy, hatred, and then indifference to those who are vulnerable, even by some of the folk who've been dismembered, but somehow view themselves as exemplars of worldly success. So they become a superficial covering of the depths of the suffering and social misery. And if their condition is the litmus test of black freedom, then only the upper black middle class becomes the terrain upon which the world sees the breakthrough and figures everything must be well for the whole community. And we know that's a lie. I don't care how many black faces we see in high places. When you get on the ground, in the hoods, in the mass incarceration regime, with the decrepit schools, with the inadequate health care, not indecent housing across the board, their suffering is either rendered invisible or the stereotypes are invoked to justify further repression and forgetting of them. So that Toni Morrison still puts what? Love at. But it's a love that is so wrong. Part of our problem these days, anytime people and all this talk about diversity. No, we talk about our vicious legacy of white supremacy that enslaved and lynched and degraded a dignified African people. That's not diversity. That's not inclusion. Leave that for the bureaucrats. We're talking about keeping it real. And when you keep it real in that way, it means then that the love that we're calling for has to be so unequivocal and now end with this story that Daddy King said it with tears in his eyes. That Brother West, the lowest moments of my life is when I saw my precious son step out of the paddy wagon that they took him from prison in the dark with a German shepherd, just the two of them in that paddy wagon in the dark. When he walked out of that paddy wagon, he could hardly walk a straight line. All he could say, this is the cross. We must bear for the freedom of our I stand it. Rather be dead than afraid. Rather be a corpse than a coward. That's not applicable to everybody. You got to have folk around who's still concerned about the children and Little League and the dances and the everyday realities in the churches and the mosques and the synagogues. But if you don't have a slice of spokespersons and leaders who love the people deep enough to tell the truth and be willing to bear that cross and die on that cross, you're never going to have a black freedom movement of great substance. You're not going to have it. That's like running around telling everybody you love your mama, but when the bullet's headed toward her, you go the other way. You don't really love her. Quit telling her that. You just like her a lot. But she loves you. She gave up everything. I'm talking about the ideal mom. I'm not saying every mama's like that. I'm talking about my mama. She gave everything. And that's precisely what has kept black people. Not just our leaders. Bishops like Curtis Mayfield and Gil Scott Heron and Nina Simone gave everything. Every song. Even their careers if they had to. For what? For the love they had for the people and the love of the music that connects an empowerment of a people who have been hated but would be loved as they are healed by the music. And once you lose that, and that's what part of the challenge is for the younger generation. The younger generation hasn't been loved deep enough. They haven't been cared for deep enough. They've been dangling in the dominant forces of greed and hatred and money and spectacle devour them. And we have to let them know, you come from a great people with a great tradition that is love-centered, service-oriented, and willing to pay an ultimate cost. And if they don't see it, they think, lo and behold, it's just some isolated individual in a museum doing Black history, rather than a vital and vibrant tradition that's still alive that they can touch. Those of us who are older and some of their peers as well. So this talk about Pharaoh, that's profound. Talk, it reminds me really of the Black Presbyterian Highland Garnett. He spoke. He told black folk, we should never confuse our situation with that of the Israelites of the Old Testament. For us, Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody river. What do you do in that situation? Somebody sing a song. Somebody say a prayer. Somebody grin. Somebody touch, hug. What we gonna do? We gonna be a people who are tied to visions that make a way out of no way. We're gonna be a people who are confronted with musical scores that's never ever heard blue notes. Because we're gonna play under the note and flatten the note and on top of the note. We're going to deal with a tradition that doesn't understand drummer songs and polyrhythms and syncopations, though it goes back to Africa, because we don't create a way out of no way in the music, in the life, in the style, in the sound, and maybe in our politics. But our politicians have never been as free and loving of black people as our musicians have been. Because the artists are the vanguard of the species. They are the ones that give us the freedom dreams. I've been blessed to teach in prison for 41 years. What's the favorite song of the brothers? Zoom by the Commodore. Lionel and Gerald. Gerald wrote that song after his wife died. And what is it about Zoom? Robin Kelly. Freedom dream. Imagination. Freedom. Your text in it. Sun Ra. Black people have tried everything possible. Let's try the impossible. What you mean, Sun Ra, coming out of Birmingham, Alabama, named Herman Blunt, but rename yourself? Come on my orchestra. I'm going to take you to different planets. I just got back from Pluto last night. He said, oh, you got to love that brother. His imagination is so capacious, so broad. You can't bring these little narrow frameworks to somehow contain him. And we ain't even got to George Clinton's mothership yet. Take you somewhere you've never been. But the problem is that's artistic and musical. How do we translate that kind of genius into our politics? That's very much all I'm doing in this campaign. Because you see, American presidential politics, it's so alien for them to even think. Genius and talent, positions of service feels over in such a way that it refuses to play the same game that they're used to playing. So when it comes to Gaza, it's not going to be a question of electoral politics and the Muslim vote X and the Arab vote. No. Those are human beings being crushed by forces that we actually can stop. This ain't no electoral political issue. This is a moral and spiritual issue, and that is the tradition of the greatness of a people who tell the truth about suffering. Well, that might not get you any votes. That's secondary. I'm going to tell the truth first. I'll tell the truth first. So whatever votes I end up getting, I'm not going to sell my soul for no votes. But lo and behold, different moment. Got a gangster Trump, fascism escalating, could be on his way to jail. Biden enabling genocide, already architect of mass incarceration, bailing out Wall Street rather than Main Street. He might run out of gas. Then we don't have either one of them. You got to go to the B team. Here come no labels. We don't know what's going on. Nobody's in control of this moment. I know God is, but nobody's in control of this moment. We're called to bear witness and be a witness and make sure we're true to the best of the highest standards set by our people who came before. And then see whether there's an awakening among poor and working people. Same is true with Cop City. Isn't it something? God, you got so many black politicians and black leaders that don't want to say a mumbling word about Gaza hardly. And when they finally get the ceasefire, they think they ought to get a moral prize after 13,000 children have been killed. Vacation Bible School in Shiloh. Jesus loved the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black or white. They are precious in his sight. I believe that. Those Palestinian babies have exactly the same value. Any baby in the world. Any baby color in the world. And we know what the response would be in Europe, in America, if those babies were European babies and white babies. And if it had been the Palestinians treating those Jewish babies in that way, it'd be a qualitatively different response. My response, I learned from Shiloh Baptist Church, is exactly the same. The Jewish babies being crushed, I got righteous indignation. Palestinians being crushed, I got righteous indignation. How come? Because it's wrong, because it's immoral, because it's unjust. And we have to be honest and candid about that. But you mean you have to cut against the grain? No, that's the thing. Got to cut against the grain.
Rahel, what must we remember? And then we're going to turn the corner.
Yeah, so allow me to apologize. My voice is the most powerful thing I possess, so I literally have to fight through speaking. allergies, coughing, practice it. But there's a few things that I would speak to. I mean, I think, the question of how did African ancestors survive the reality of slavery? I mean, there's no better question that we could ask. How do you survive what we will never know fully what they went through? It is incomprehensible. It is ineffable. There's no way to wrap our minds around that degree of suffering, right? And not just individuals, but collectives and families and tribes and masses of people literally living a hell. In some ways, what we're seeing in Palestine, lifetime and real time, a real-time hell. I believe our African ancestors operated in this continuum that I talk about in Imagine Freedom, of gripping the past, having to be resilient in the present, and imagining a future. The only way to survive was to imagine, live beyond the present moment. Because if you fully lived in the moment, there is no way that our minds are not designed to survive what they survived.
That's true.
If you truly acknowledge what is happening to you. And part of what we're seeing in Palestine is a people who have figured out, have parts of themselves that the oppressor can't get. I mean, you have a people whose land is controlled, whose water supply is controlled, whose food is controlled, every aspect of their existence, their freedom of movement. You cannot move without checkpoints. I mean, so very reminiscent of slavery in many ways, right? And so with all it is, we're watching an entire people who are still proclaiming God, still proclaiming paradise, still caring about the needs of other people. So part of the remembrance, the idea that there are parts of me that the oppressor can't touch, because those are spiritual parts.
Yes, yes.
Spiritual parts.
That's right.
Right? So when all material things are out of your control, you have no control over. The spiritual realm is where they derive their power. And the whole world is sitting back and saying, how can they do that? How can they do that? So I would say in real time, pay attention to what we're witnessing. So I would say that. I would also say, let's also remember why Jesus was crucified. Jesus was crucified because they wanted a king. They wanted a king. They wanted something imperialistic. They wanted a throne. They wanted power. They wanted all the things that we connect to opulence. And he didn't come the way that they come. Came as a servant. Came as a product of single women, mothers. A product of Palestine itself, Bethlehem, an occupied land in the West Bank. All these ways in which he was not what they thought the Messiah was. So I think we should remember that the very thing that we do today is what got Jesus crucified. Misunderstanding him, misinterpreting him, making him into what we want him to be, using him as a genie in a bottle that serves our needs, does what we need for that particular day. We got a to-do list, and it's all assigned to Jesus, right? So we must remember that he was crucified for the very thing that we do. They told Jesus he wasn't enough. That's what they did. You are not enough, but you proclaim to be everything. So I would say let's remember that part of us reclaiming Jesus out what enough means for Jesus. What does it mean for Jesus to be enough today? And there's a way in which, if we really get down to who Jesus was, so contrary to who we are, so contrary to how we move in the world, how we talk. So I think the most important thing to ask ourselves is, what are those parts of ourselves that must die for Christ to be born? So there are parts of us that must literally be buried with Jesus, because Jesus is inside of us waiting to be resurrected. I experienced a part of that on the continent myself. I literally had to leave the United States. I had to leave it because there was an American immigrant that died. There was a black girl in love with the empire and success and the education and the advancement, all the things that America gave to me. I had to break up. So I went to the continent, and it was a remembrance that operated as resistance. Remembrance of ancestral wisdom, remembrance of community, remembrance of cooperative economics, remembrance of a shared village system, remembrance of matriarchs as the women who ran everything, remembrance of not just the names we know, but the names we don't know.
Yes.
Remembrance of the ancestors who will not be in the history books, but are why we are here today.
That's
And
right.
I would say this, black folks know suffering intimately. And there's a way in which we forget how much we know about suffering. So part of our resistance is remembering our intimacy with suffering. You watch people die. You watch people struggle. You watch people be poor. You watch people have nothing but make something out of it. And yet we forget. Yet we forget. We watched it. You don't have to read about it on CNN. You saw it. No, you saw it in Atlanta. How did Atlanta become the black Mecca? How did D.C. become the Mecca? How did these places become the Mecca? They became the Mecca out of black struggle to survive. Don't ever forget.
Yes.
So let's turn the corner. And I want you to turn both inward, but also to your left and to your right. And I want you to take note of what has struck you thus far in this conversation. For those of us who are online, feel free to use the chat, your journal, whatever you may have nearby, your phone, the notes there. But let's take a moment. And I want you to jot the words, the phrases, the sentiments, what may be coming up from that place that empire has no jurisdiction over. What's calling up, or what's coming up for you and calling to you out of this conversation so far? So take about 120 seconds, about 2 minutes, and jot your own notes. But then I want to invite us to take about 5 minutes to turn to our right and to our left and to begin to talk to our neighbors about what's coming up for us and what's compelling for us in this conversation. All right? Let's go. And I'll call us back when it's time to come back to the large group.
Doing a wonderful job.
Yes, you are.
Your eloquence, sister. Your eloquence is off the
I
chart.
learned from you. I learned from watching you. That's it.
Just with him yesterday. And the day before. You know, like come there, man. Oh, but brother, you doing such a mighty. Lord have mercy.
They tell you that the people have no cash. If there are any questions, that they're supposed to just let us know, and I'll bring it up here to you.
Okay.
All right? So I don't know if you want to ask them to have questions or not, and I can get the questions from them, okay?
Are you bringing up the questions
Yes,
from the
okay.
online or from
No, from the online, I'm gonna have to get it from up there. I think there's somebody monitoring that.
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. I'm going to ask for us to pause the conversation, and I do mean pause because that doesn't mean stop. This is just beginning to percolate the kinds of conversations that we need to continue in and beyond our time together. But I want to call us back to the large group, and what may have emerged from your conversations are a few questions that you may want to send up. And we are not going to necessarily be able to answer or address all of those questions in the remainder of our time together, but we want to make sure that they are under consideration, but also that you keep a hold of them, right? Because these kinds of conversations are meant not just to generate answers, right, but to generate the kinds of questions that become the North Star for our activity individually and collectively beyond this moment. So thank you for giving yourself access to one another. We need more spaces where we have access to the collective wisdom in the room. And so I'm going to pose one question that is actually asked of one of our guests, but I want to ask of both of us because it invites us to answer a question, Rahel, that you named in Imagine Freedom that comes from the Dream Defenders in Florida who asked, can we dream together? Can we begin to imagine, right, alternatives to these things that we've taken for granted, right? That structural poverty is like the law of gravity. No, it's not. It's a set of arrangements and agreements that we've made, and we can make alternative arrangements and agreements. So can we begin to imagine together? You know, in Imagine Freedom, you said freedom is tied to our capacity to resist inhumane and unjust systems, our capacity to defy the grip of trauma, both personally and communally, a reclamation and taking back what has been lost or stolen from us and reclaiming who we were before we were taught to hate ourselves, right? Dr. West, as I look at your platform, it is an imagining of new structures, of new systems. It's not just about how we tweak the existing things that we inherited, but we are actively taking the responsibility to co-create new ways of being in the world and translating that, right, into new political and economic and otherwise systems. So I want to ask both of you this question, which is, how do we move into a new way of thinking about the future? Or I'll pose it a different way that Rahel and I talked about before. Who do we need to be to imagine and co-create the future that we want to see? This is about imagining and dreaming together. So I want to pose that question to both of you.
It is, Matt asked me that question many, many years ago. I think it was when I was moving to the continent and we were having a conversation. Ferguson, Palestine transformed me. Ferguson was the first time that as we were protesting, helicopters were hovering over us. And, my brother is a product of liberation fronts. My sister is. They were literal freedom fighters, carrying weaponry, being trained as soldiers. My brother was a political prisoner, so I was very accustomed to revolution. And as though I had heard about revolution and it was normalized for me, there was no trace of it in the United States of America until Ferguson. Because Ferguson was this moment in which working class and poor Black people showed the world that they were not scared of America. They were not scared of the state. They were fearless, right? And there was a way in which Ferguson made me believe that the revolution many of us studied was possible in this country, and not just something of the past, not just a product of the freedom fighters who are no more, but that it could happen within our own generation. So there was a way in which I watched them say, whose streets are streets? And I don't think we fully understood what that meant. What does it mean to say whose streets are streets? It meant that these are our communities, right? And they fought because we have this weird relationship with American soil, you know? But here were young black people saying, no matter whose name is on the deed, these are our streets. So I think they modeled revolution for us. They modeled it, and what did the media do? What did empire do? It quickly erased our memory of them. Because if Ferguson became the image of revolution, what would happen in America? If Baltimore became the image, if Baton Rouge became the image, what would have happened in this country? So they shifted our memory of what happened. And they told us who the heroes were of that story. We looked at the images they wanted us to see. But there is something powerful about Ferguson, and this is the 10-year anniversary of the uprising. And nobody's talking about it. So I believe that we saw people who said, I am worthy, like Dr. West said, even if you don't deem me worthy. Mike Brown was worthy, even though you lynched him in the streets and left him there for 4 hours, right? So there was a way in which they declared their own self-worth. And I think that's something for us to hold on to. The other thing I do want to say is, when I look at how the Bible begins, Genesis, it begins with God's love for humanity, God's creation of humanity, God's great creation, grand vision, the Adam, you know, you shall not be alone. There is an Eve for you. There is a helpmate. All this beautiful love story that's taking place. And what happens? An enemy infiltrates. An enemy infiltrates and declares that the God you think you serve is not the God you know. That enemy doesn't love you. And what was the purpose of that? It was violent disintegration. It was disintegration. Because if he could break up that unity, that solidarity, everything else would work itself out. Cain and Abel, every story you could ever think of. The brother killing the brother. So my point in saying all of that is we forget about the enemy occupation. We forget about the violent intervention that happened in the very beginning, meant to tear us apart. I call for us to imagine a world in which black people love each other fiercely. Love each other fiercely. A world in which black men love black women enough to be self-disciplined, okay? Because we're amongst family right now. And so if we want to envision the world, let's envision a world where black men love our community enough not to let their egos destroy their legacies. Because what happens? You kill the man's legacy, you kill the movement. They've always had that tactic, right? And so many of our men have succumbed to that. So part of this is radical, revolutionary discipline. Discipline. We need to get disciplined because one thing that we have seen is that they have a plan for us. They do. They have a plan. It's very strategic. It's multi-generational. It's funded. It's organized. And we just out here being reckless. I operate in a tradition.
My dear sister, oh, you a truth teller. How should we be? Well, I'm going to speak on very personal terms. I want to be like Jesus. More courageous, more compassionate, more serving, more willing to live as well as die for something bigger than me. I learned as a child, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. So any talk about the kingdom of God means it's not a brand, it's a cause. It's not a market strategy for your career. It's a moral cause that enables your spiritual calling. And when we have that on a broader scale, and it's always going to be a significant slice of the community. There's never been a freedom movement of any oppressed people where all of the oppressed people went in one direction. How many churches did Martin get in Montgomery? 19 out of 112? And yet we tell our young folk, everybody was with Martin. They lying, they lying, they lying. Those preachers were scared, and some of them were paid off by the white supremacist powers that be. That's human. Everybody wrestling with fear in their lives. What breaks the back of fear? Love. That's the only thing that breaks the back of fear. If you don't have the depth of love, then you're going to be manipulated because they're going to keep the fear inside of you. There's no doubt about that. And so when I say I want to be like Jesus, and people say, well, that sounds so evangelical. You can't be on Pontius Pilate's payroll and follow Jesus into the temple and run out the money changers. Can't do it. Because if, in order to follow Jesus and be true to your calling, means that somehow you got to give up the things you invested everything in, there's a good chance that idolatry is going to win rather than Jesus. And that's true for everybody. Doesn't matter what color you are. Doesn't matter what gender, sexual orientation you are. That's a human thing that cuts very deep. So the question becomes, how do we generate a cloud of witnesses who looks enough like Jesus that it becomes contagious enough for other people to say, let me check it out. Look like they got something I don't have. See, American culture ain't nothing but a joyless quest for insatiable pleasures. And that part that our dear sister was talking about is joy. That's what you see when you look in the sparkle in the eye of your child. That's not a pleasure. That's a joy. Or the memory of your grandmama praying with such power just for you, and you know you don't deserve it. And yet you remember 50 years later the depth of that love. That's joy. And the old folk, you say, I got a joy that the world didn't give me and the world can't take away. You see it in the music. These brothers playing these drums ain't talking about pleasure. They're talking about a joy that cuts deeper, and the benchmark, the fruit of Christian life is what? Joy. And if you're pursuing something which is your calling and you don't have no joy in it, then you better check yourself, because you're not going to be a long-distance runner. You're going to be a sprinter. And so freedom movement becomes a fad and a fashion and a style rather than a calling and a vocation and something you willing to throw down for life. We listen to these drums. We could hear Elvin Jones too, because it was a calling for Elvin, just like it's a calling for you all. That cuts deep. And that's what we need, a depth of commitment of being in that way. And we need each other to do it. We can't do it by ourselves. And I know myself, I got to have some grace. Because I was a Jesus before I met, I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. Ain't nothing but the Holy Ghost holding me together. So pray for me. Pray for me. Oh, yes. I stand in the need of community, friends, partners, comrades. Even my critics I listen to, and my enemies I push them aside and push them off me like jackals, because I got my eye focused on something grander. My eyes are on the prize, on the kingdom. That cuts much deeper. My dear brother had a formulation today in his powerful sermon when he said we got to learn how to defeat defeat. Is that right, Pastor Williams? You remember that formulation? Boy, that must have hit you so hard when you wrote that down in your sermon. Defeating defeat. You see, that's what blues is. That's why we are blues people. We look catastrophe in the face And then we go beyond catastrophe. We don't allow it to have the last word, but we know it's there. The strange fruit is still there after Billy sings the song. But she's transfigured that catastrophe into a power that takes us into a state where we're willing to fight it. That's a blues people that the great Leroy Jones and Amir Baraka are reminded of. Defeating the defeat. But it's a spiritual place. It really is. Really is. And that's the war on young people. Because see, the powers that be dumb down their music, dumb down the culture in such a way they think life is just pleasure and titillation and stimulation. But we got some magnificent young folk who hungry for the joy, hungry for the real thing, hungry for the love, not the lust, hungry for the freedom, not the appearance of freedom. Oh, that's a different thing. That's a very different thing. They know that in the last 50 years we produced a whole generation overwhelmingly of peacocks who walk around, look at me and how successful and rich I am, and they know peacocks strut because they can't fly. Oh, we are people of eagles, not just peacocks strutting around. No, we want to sacrifice for something. We're going to fight for something and pass it on to the younger generation. Mm-hmm.
I want to invite those of you who have questions that are written to pass them to those who are running questions from online or in person. But I want to treat two questions that came to us within the context really of what you just mentioned, Dr. West, about, you mentioned Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams.
Yes, yeah. Classic.
As opposed to freedom facades, right? And I want to, on this note, bring this conversation home. We are in the ATL. You called it the Black Mecca, right? We are in the state of Georgia, again, which is and has been for the last few years an epicenter, right? That is a leverage point in American politics. And as a Black Mecca, it has been cast as an exemplar of what Black freedom looks like.
That's right.
Even leveraging the memory, the nostalgic memory of as the cradle of the civil rights movement. Yet, this is the leader in income inequality in the country, right? Part of your tour was a visit to what we now call Cop City, right? Again, an epicenter of a national conversation. And what we call Cop City is one of 68 sites around the country since 2020, where we hit the streets enraged by George Floyd's murder. 69 sites across the country are now either built or being erected. Cop cities all over this country. It's not just Atlanta. But again, this is the focal point, right? And so I want to invite us to speak to that contradiction. I'm thinking about Adrienne Marie Brown's note that says, we are in an imagination battle. And often I feel like I'm trapped in somebody else's imagination. And I must engage my own imagination to break free, right? Because if I don't, what even in the pursuit of what we may call freedom, we end up reproducing the very thing nobody says they want. So this gets to a question of the sources of our imagination, right? And how we begin to imagine a future differently and hold on, right? Through the winds of change and through the temptations of the moment and the dangling rewards of the system as it is to actually co-create an alternative future. I want to invite y'all to talk about, in concrete terms, what are some of the alternatives, right, that are available to us that we may be able to begin to engage in and co-create. If not a cop city, what does public safety look like from the perspective of Black faith? What does foreign policy look like from the perspective of Black faith, right? What do food systems look like from the perspective of black faith? What's the alternative that's called for in light of who we are, whose we are, and what we're called to be in the world?
Well, we have had some high-quality questions in this dialogue. My God. Partly thanks to this president, former president, but he's always president of ITC in many ways, and all of you all's questions as well. But, you know, for me, when you think about alternatives, you think about different ways in which you first have to tell the truth about why you are so locked in. You see, it's like dealing with addiction. You can have all the dreams in the world at night, but if you wake up the next morning and you're still addicted, then your deeds and your praxis are not in conformity with the dreams that you have. There's nothing wrong with dreams. Dreams have to be translated into reality. And the only way you do that is you have to be connected with others to help give you wind at your back so you can break the back of addiction. You see, now, I've never really been addicted to drugs and so forth. I probably missed out on some things I needed to check out. But so then I'd be able to speak with more authority, you know what I mean? But I'm just imagining what it's like to break the back of addiction in that way. And I think about that in terms of the frameworks that we have, the shadows of Pharaoh that our dear sister Rahel was talking about. I tend to use a much more barbershop-like language, which is we just need to get off the plantations that we own, mentally and spiritually. You see, sometimes the plantations can be Harvard University. Walk around with golden cuffs, and you discover overnight, lo and behold, they pull the cover over you quick. And all of a sudden, what you thought was the president and what you thought was a black professor status is gone like that. And you walk around surprised and you say, you didn't see it coming, didn't you? We are living in a chickens come home to roost moment. That's what Malcolm talked about. In those moments when you reap what you sow, the very things you've been repressing come back to haunt you. And it's on every level: spiritual, social, economic, inequality, psychically, spiritually, artistically, and so on. And so first you have to tell that truth and be honest. But in telling that truth, you're not just pointing the finger at others, but you're also pointing the finger at yourself. That's what our dear sister started with, telling that truth about ourselves. How do we get off of the plantations? And that's where the freedom, the only thing that gets us off of plantations is radical love and freedom and radical freedom and love. That's the only thing that can get you off. Because if you don't have the love, you got the fear. You don't have the freedom, you got the psychic bondage and spiritual bondage. You see? And the only way you actually get off the plantation, Harriet Tubman taught us, is what? You got to go. Get moving. Get moving. What did she say when she said many of the slaves knew they were slaves? She could have freed more of them. You know how much radical love and love and courage that takes for Harriet Tubman to do that, given the disease that she suffered from? You know how much she loved black people to do that? Now, most of us not going to meet that standard, but we know what the standard is. But then when she's willing to give it all, folk got to be ready for it. If they're not ready for it, she's going to end up with spies in her camp. That's going to tell the slaveholder, here come Harriet again. Here come Harriet again. We're going to get her this time. Oh, yes, we're going to track her down this time. The FBI and the CIA and COINTELPRO and all the other spies in the movement, we're going to get them together to get Harriet. And Harriet just keep moving so quick, she make MC Hammer look like a Boy Scout. She's just bouncing. How you missing out on those minefields? She going with her Bible, too. Bible half as big as, almost big as her. She's only 4'11". How you doing, Harriet? Well, I got a joy, I got a spirit, I got something this empire can't touch. You see, this is what I mean by she's Christ-like. She was in love with black people, in love with Jesus, shaped by the blood, and she was free. She was off the plantation. We need to incorporate that in our spirit.
Yeah, so for me, a few things come to mind. One is Pastor Mike Warren out of Harlem, good friend of mine, an amazing brother, First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, product of Morehouse. But he preached this powerful sermon at Morehouse where he said it took one night to get the children of Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of the children of Israel. So, 40 years to get Egypt out of the children of Israel. You know, I look to Christ. How did Christ imagine freedom for people? I think of Christ encountering a person who was oppressed spiritually, physically, mentally, psychologically. The first thing that he did was identify that there was a demon present. There was oppression present. He was aware of the presence. The second thing he did was say, tell me your name. Tell me your name. Because liberation could not come until naming happened first. There had to be naming of the oppression, naming of the subjugation, naming of the stronghold, naming of the generational cycles, naming of the generational curses. You had to name that thing because you couldn't get it out until you first named it. And he knew the practice of exorcism based on the source of oppression. Many of us can't name what we're watching, what we're seeing, what has our children locked into phones, what has us addicted to wealth. What is that demon? Tell me your name. He casted it out based on the source of oppression. So as we imagine freedom, as we imagine a new way, let's start by naming those things that are holding us in bondage, right? And if you don't understand how money and luxury are demonic presence in your life, a demonic presence in your life, holding you hostage, making you think that you gotta wake up and prove your worth. You can't sit still, because if you sit still, you don't have value. What is that demon? Tell me your name. So I encourage us to imagine freedom by imagining deliverance, imagining ourselves freed of the things keeping us in bondage, the very things that kept Egypt within them for 40 years. And there's a way in which we don't have to be enslaved anymore. Our shackles are digital. Our shackles are psychological. Our shackles are spiritual. So our people have reimagined liberation as what we see today. This ain't freedom. This ain't the promised land. But as long as you're convinced that we've arrived, because you made the promised land a seat at the table, right? You pull up your chair and you think we arrived at the promised land, at a table designed for the destruction and despair and annihilation of you and your children. You pulled up a seat for your children to be destroyed. You just wanted an invitation, right? Hell with their invitation. Hell with it. Hell with it. Don't invite me to my destruction. Okay? We're talking about a table-tossing Jesus. Imagine that. Imagine that. A table-tossing Jesus. Until you have that spirit abiding in you, how do you move into the room and start tossing tables with your words, tossing tables with your paychecks, tossing tables with your vote, tossing tables with your sermons? tossing tables with your relationships, with your posts on social media. Toss some tables. You pulling up chairs.
Can we marinate on that just a little bit?
Doc said we need to marinate for a moment on that.
No, I understand. Let's come over there.
Let that soak in.
Let that soak in.
Yeah. Let's take a deep breath. Let's take a deep breath. Yeah. Turning over tables, not pulling up chairs.
That distinction.
Thank you.
Ooh, Lord.
Thank you. So in the spirit of turning over tables, this question, Dr. West, and then we're going to turn toward the end of our time together, in which I want to ask you both to pose a question to the community. But in the spirit of turning over tables, there's a cluster of questions here about your run for president. One person says democracy's on the line. Everything is on the table. So what's your response to people saying that independent candidates draw votes from Biden and put us under the threat of fascism with Trump? Another question asked how are we positioned to impact this election, right? March 12th, right here in Georgia, we go through, we go to ballots, we go to our ballot boxes, as it were. Then there's a question that says, what if you can't win? Is this just a protest movement or is this a real run? Right? Are we turning over the tables or are we pulling, what are we doing here, right? So here we are right now in a moment where we're engaged in a political process, right? And what ought we be up to and what are you up to in this political process?
Yes, that was a wonderful question. That's from the audience, huh? Yeah. Okay. Oh, we got some all high quality folk out there. This is beautiful. It's beautiful. Absolutely. You see, I don't believe that anybody, let alone black people, need to be following Pied Pipers. I think we need to think critically for ourselves. And people are going to raise their voices in their distinctive ways. People don't need to agree with what I'm doing. I'm being true to myself. You see, taking votes away from Biden. No, if he doesn't earn the votes, they're not his. See, nobody owns anybody's vote. But there's no way that we can vote our way into freedom. We talk about structures and institutions. We talk about empires. They got 800 military units around the world in 130 countries. You got U.S. special operations. You got 62 cents going for every $1 for the budget, and therefore they find trillions of dollars for wars, but can't find a penny when it's time to deal with education. Can't find a penny, it's time to health. That's just warped priorities. We have to tell the truth about that. And we tell the truth in the name of the suffering of the least of these. So that the very notion of protest versus winning, where does that distinction come from? If you tell the truth, there's always an element of protest. If you pursue injustice, there's always an element of protest, but it's not reduced to protest. That's like saying black music is protest just because it's upset with how black people are being treated. No, black music is about the richness of black genius, talent, and humanity, and there's a protest element in it, but it goes far beyond the things that has to do with what it means to be human. The same is true with any black freedom movement. It's so much more than that. And because we're at a moment that is so fluctuating, we don't know what's going on. But one thing I do know, that if I'm true, which I shall be, all the way through to November, and they allow me to debate with Biden and Trump, that's like inviting Curtis Mayfield to compete with Roy Rogers and Pat Boone. I tell you that right now. Now, I know I ain't no Curtis, but I can tell you one thing. You let me go at them for an hour and a half in front of the world, and I'm going to pull the veil over all of their lies and their crimes and reveal and unveil them to be who they really are. They're going to have so many commercials coming in and special commercials coming in. Well, no, we telling the truth. This one's for Fannie Lou Hamer. This one's for Martin Luther King. This one's for Stokely. This one's for... And I'll just be myself. My Christian self. Because I'll be doing it out of love for the people. But you don't know how God is going to use you. You just got to be true to your calling. That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you, sir. So we are turning a corner to the end of our time together. Again, just a pause, but this process and this conversation will continue beyond this moment. Well, I want us to close this portion of our time together by asking questions of the community, of this particular community. Again, around this theme of black faith in a culture and in an hour of chaos. What do you want to pose to us as questions for us to take from this place?
Well, in the book I say, I don't have the answers, but I care deeply about the questions. So I'll ask a lot of questions. I don't want to just leave you with one because there's so much at stake. So one question is, are you a reformer or are you the remnant? You know, and I have to ask you that because the Bible speaks of a remnant. A remnant. And when you are a reformer, you work within the system. You fix the system. You band-aid the system. You paint it up. You know, you work with an architect to make it inhabitable, to make it somewhere where we can abide. But when you are the remnant, there's a way in which everything you touch is transformed. That anyone who hears you, sees you, literally just the hem of his garment. Right? So when you are a reformer, you do the enemy's work. When you are the remnant, that anointing is so powerful. It transforms everything around you. I have to ask you, are you a reformer or are you the remnant? I must also ask you, what parts of you must die for the world that we want to live in to be born? What parts of you must die? And the reason I have to leave you with that is because in the book I talk about a black Eden, our version of the Garden of Eden. Black people have never known paradise, ever. And paradise for white men, paradise for Europeans has always been a journey of colonization, always. So how do we become paradise? Partly for our children. What does paradise look like in you so you yourself are not a source of trauma? So you yourself are not the continuation of generational cycles of pain and suffering, right? How do you become that paradise? What version of you must you imagine for us to have a black America and diaspora that is not only livable, but beautiful? Those are all my questions. And I will say, what are those sacred, indigenous, ancestral secrets that we have forgotten, that we don't share? There is a generation of freedom fighters, of prophets, of priests who have left us. And there's very few left. how do you continue to tell the story of their wisdom, their brilliance, so that we can preserve the best of us and not pass on this new version of Black excellence? I am here to call on my generation. If we must, bury Black excellence. Because if we are really being honest with ourselves, Black excellence is another form of the American dream. That's truly what it is. It's materialism, it's luxury, it's opulence, it's exclusion. It is not liberation. You know, and so I ask you, what does it mean to be excellent today? Because the excellence I know led to the martyrdom of Fred Hampton. The excellence that I know led to the killing of Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara. Those were the remnants of Black excellence on African soil, American soil. They killed us. They killed Audre Lorde through cancer, liver cancer, breast cancer. They annihilated those who were excellent. They killed all of them because they knew who was excellent. Our problem is we don't know what's great about us. We don't know, but they do. That's why they have the FBI list. That's why they identify the Black Messiah. They know our greatest and we don't. So who amongst you is great? If you can figure that part out, we will come into the imagination of what we can be, because right now we have forgotten the definition of Black excellence.
What question do you want to pose to us, Dr. Webb?
Yes. I mean, it really is a compliment to be on the FBI list if you're in the Black freedom struggle. It reminds me in many ways of, in the history of American music, what is excellence? The Grammys. Sam Cooke never got one. Sly Stone never got one. The genius of geniuses, Curtis Mayfield, never got one. Milli Vanilli got two. Just keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind. We love Aretha, we love Beyonce, we love Quincy, we love Stevie Wonder. They got a lot of Grammys, but the Grammy was not the authority that gave us the genius and talent and touching of our souls of those artists. It was the afterthought. I was blessed to go with Toni Morrison when she got the Nobel Prize. You know, we were teaching together at Princeton for many, many years. We owned the plane together. And I say, Sister Toni, I say, you know, these white brothers in Norway, you know, they make their decisions and things, and it's a beautiful thing that now the whole world will take notice associated with the Nobel Prize. But you know and I know, you've been a genius for a long, long time, and you don't need no Nobel Prize committee to tell you and us that. That's what it means to reconceive of excellence and greatness on our terms. And that's crucial. My question to each and every one of you is this. I'm here with my visionary campaign manager, one of them, Sister Kiana. Just raise your hand, Sister Kiana. Raise your hand, Sister Kiana. And this Brother Stanley told a distinguished professor, last student of James Cone, and one and only Brother Bashir Jones. But we're on the way. We're going to zip right out of here because we're going to the cemetery for the grave of Brother Bashir's precious, priceless mother. What is the source of our joy in our lives that constitutes wind at our back, so that the connection between those gone and those still here, the afterlife of those who are no longer living but whose spirits will forever be living and who are now looking over the porch of heaven. What is the source of joy in your life that keeps you sustained day in and day out in the form of either memory of those who are gone or the form of relation of those who are here, or it could be the precious child and grandchild, and the connection of you and the future as you slowly begin to fade off the scene.
Will you join me in thanking Dr. West and Rahel Tesfamarian for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conversation? Yes, indeed. This joy I have, the world didn't give it, and the world can't take away. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah. And I want to now call, to close out our time together, one of the co-hosting pastors of our gathering, Reverend Dr. Mark Ogunwale Lomax, will issue a charge to Courageous Community. Dr. Lomax, will you come? And let me say this, that as he comes and closes us out, we can make our way to the book signing. So you have an opportunity to purchase and have signed Imagine Freedom today. Pastor Williams, where will we be? Right in the back near the fellowship hall. So you have an opportunity to do that. So now for our closing.
Thank you, Reverend Williams. You've done a great job moderating. Thank you so much. Three things. First, I charge you to love yourselves and to love each other. Dr. West, I say that love, in practical terms, is radical acceptance. It is acceptance without judgment, regardless of how one identifies or shows up in the world. I don't think we can get to anything you all talked about without radical acceptance, without love. We can't get to a common agenda without love as radical acceptance. Second, I charge you to be the bent note. I first heard this idea from Dr. Mia White at MIT. The bent note is something I think that most black musicians are familiar with, is when you take a note and you extend it until it becomes something else. And it is a critique and criticism of what people call normalcy. Black folk, be the bent note. Be the ones that are willing to go to whatever extreme necessary to claim your freedom. Bend the note. And then thirdly, I charge you to allow the Holy Spirit room in your life. I believe that critical and crucial imagination is the gift of the Holy Spirit. So love each other, be the bent note, and allow the Holy Spirit to have her way.
So now let us receive our benediction. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Shadowed beneath God's hand, may we forever stand true to our God and true to our native land. Amen and Ashe. Go in peace.
Testing 1, 2.